He stood outside her door, soaked by the rain, his voice low and unsteady. I don't usually ask for help, but can I stay here tonight? Some questions aren't asked lightly. When a man swallows his pride and asks for shelter, it's never just about a place to sleep. It's about what he's running from, and what he's afraid you might discover if you let him in. This night was never supposed to happen. But once the question was asked, everything changed. Welcome back to Prime Tale. Here, we tell emotional stories about broken moments, hidden truths, and the single decisions that change lives forever. If you enjoy deep, slow-burn stories like this, subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications, so you never miss what happens next. Now, let's begin. The silence had already lasted too long by the time he raised his hand to knock. He stood outside her door, shoulders tense, rainwater sliding slowly from his hair down the collar of his jacket. The hallway light buzzed faintly above him, flickering just enough to make everything feel uncertain, like the building itself wasn't sure it wanted him there. He lowered his hand. For a moment, he considered walking away. It wouldn't be the first time he chose pride over help. In fact, it had been his pattern for most of his life. Handle it alone. Figure it out. Don't inconvenience anyone. Don't let people see you when you're breaking. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was nowhere else to go. Behind the door was warmth. Safety. A person who knew him just enough to hesitate, but not enough to hate him. That thin line was all he had left. He knocked. The sound felt louder than it should have been. Footsteps approached from inside. Slow. Careful. The door opened only part way, stopping at the chain. She looked surprised to see him. Not angry. Not afraid. Just unprepared. It's late, she said. I know, he replied quietly. His voice sounded steady, but it took effort to keep it that way. Everything inside him wanted to collapse the moment someone acknowledged his presence. They stood there, separated by a door that felt heavier than steel. Rain dripped from his sleeves onto the floor. He hadn't brought a bag. He hadn't planned this visit. He had simply walked until his feet brought him here. I wouldn't have come, he said, choosing his words carefully, if I had another option. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes scanned his face, lingering longer than he expected. She noticed the exhaustion first. The tension in his jaw. The way he kept his hands visible, like he needed to prove he wasn't a threat. What happened? She asked. He almost laughed. That question was too big for the doorway, too heavy for the hour, too dangerous for a man who had spent years burying the truth under silence. I just need somewhere to be, he said instead. Just for tonight. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows behind her. She hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the door. He noticed, and immediately stepped back. It's okay, he said quickly. I shouldn't have put you in this position. That was the truth he always used. The polite exit. Make it easy for people to say no. Leave before rejection can land. But his body betrayed him. His shoulders slumped slightly. His breath hitched once before he forced it steady again. She saw that too. Why here? She asked. He swallowed. Because this was the only door I could knock on without lying about why. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. He hadn't planned to say that. It just slipped out. Honesty had a way of doing that when you were exhausted enough. She unlocked the chain but didn't open the door yet. What aren't you telling me? She asked. He looked away. That I messed up, he said. That I trusted the wrong people. That everything I thought was stable disappeared tonight. She waited. He exhaled slowly. And that I don't have the energy to pretend I'm fine anymore. The door finally opened. Not all the way. Just enough. Come in, she said. But only for tonight. Relief hit him so hard it almost knocked him off balance. Thank you, he said quietly. As he stepped inside, warmth wrapped around him. Physically first, emotionally second. The door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. Neither of them spoke. He stood there, dripping onto her floor, suddenly aware of how much space he occupied. How vulnerable he was inside someone else's safe place. You can leave your shoes there, she said. He nodded, doing exactly as told. She handed him a towel. Their fingers brushed for less than a second, but it was enough to send a strange awareness through both of them. You don't have to explain anything tonight, she added. Sleep. We'll talk tomorrow. He wanted to say more. To promise he wouldn't be trouble. To swear he wouldn't overstay his welcome. Instead, he simply nodded again. Because deep down, he knew something neither of them was ready to admit yet. This wasn't just a night. And the question he asked at the door had already started changing everything. He didn't sleep right away. The couch was comfortable enough, the blanket warm, but his body refused to relax. Years of conditioning had taught him that safety never lasted long. Comfort was temporary. Quiet was suspicious. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home. The faint hum of electricity in the walls, the distant tick of a clock, the occasional creak of wood settling. Every sound reminded him that he didn't belong here. Not really. He folded his hands over his chest, fingers interlocked tightly, as if holding himself together. His jacket hung over the chair nearby, still damp. He hadn't asked where to dry it. Asking for small things felt just as difficult as asking for big ones. Across the hallway, her bedroom door was closed. That was a relief. He didn't trust himself to explain anything tonight, not without his voice breaking, not without revealing how thin the ground beneath him really was. He had spent too long building the image of a man who could handle life alone. That image had shattered earlier that evening. He closed his eyes, and the memory returned immediately. The argument had started small. It always did. A disagreement about money, about loyalty, about promises that were never meant to be broken. Voices raised, accusations thrown like weapons. Then the truth, sharp and unforgiving. He had been cut out, pushed aside, blamed for mistakes that weren't his alone. And just like that, the life he thought he was standing on vanished beneath his feet. His chest tightened. He rolled onto his side, pressing his face into the pillow, breathing slowly through his nose the way he'd taught himself to do when things spiraled. Control the breath. Control the body. The mind would follow. It didn't work. A sharp inhale escaped him before he could stop it. He sat up abruptly, elbows resting on his knees, hands gripping the blanket now. The room felt smaller, warmer, like the walls were closing in. He hated this feeling. Hated that he couldn't outrun it anymore. He had always been the dependable one. The man people leaned on. The man who fixed things. Broken plans, broken homes, broken expectations. He had learned early that being useful was safer than being vulnerable. No one abandoned the man who solved problems. But tonight had proven something painful. Even the strongest man could be disposable. He rubbed his face slowly, dragging his hands down over his eyes. He hadn't cried. He wasn't sure he remembered how. What he felt instead was hollow, a quiet emptiness that sat heavy in his chest. He didn't notice her footsteps at first. She moved quietly, careful not to startle him. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that it didn't feel like an intrusion. "You're awake." He looked up, startled, then immediately tried to compose himself. "Sorry," he said. "Did I wake you?" "No," she replied. "I couldn't sleep either." She stood a few feet away, not crossing the invisible boundary between guest and host. She was wearing a loose sweater now, her hair pulled back casually. She looked real, unguarded. "Do you want some water?" she asked. "That would be great," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She handed him a glass. Their fingers didn't touch this time. He took a slow sip, then another, grounding himself in the simple action. When he finished, he held the glass in both hands, unsure what to do next. "You don't have to explain anything," she said again, as if sensing the tension in him. "I meant that." "I know," he said. "I just don't want you thinking I make a habit of this." She tilted her head slightly. "Of what?" "Showing up unannounced. Needing help." Something in her expression softened. "You don't seem like someone who asks for help often," she said. He let out a quiet, humorless breath. "I don't." There it was. The truth, spoken plainly. She sat down in the chair across from him, still keeping distance, still respecting the space he clearly needed. "Why not?" she asked. He considered brushing it off, offering a shallow answer. But something about the quiet, about the way she wasn't pushing, made honesty feel less dangerous. "Because every time I did," he said slowly, "it was used against me." She didn't interrupt. "So I learned to handle things alone," he continued. "To be the one people relied on instead. It felt safer that way." "And tonight?" she asked gently. He looked down at his hands. "Tonight, I ran out of options." The words tasted bitter, but also relieving. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "You know," she said, "needing help doesn't make you weak." He almost laughed again. "That's easy to say," he replied. "Harder to believe when you've spent your life proving the opposite." Silence settled between them, not heavy this time, just thoughtful. She stood after a moment. "You should try to rest," she said. "Tomorrow will look different." He wanted to believe that. As she turned to go back to her room, he spoke again, surprising himself. "Thank you," he said, "for not asking too many questions." She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. "Everyone deserves one night where they don't have to explain themselves," she said. Then she disappeared down the hall, leaving him alone with his thoughts again. This time, though, the room felt less oppressive. He lay back down, pulling the blanket up to his chest. His breathing slowly evened out. The tightness in his chest loosened just enough to let exhaustion take over. As sleep finally crept in, one thought lingered quietly in his mind. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't facing it completely alone. Morning didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, slipping through the thin gap between the curtains, laying a pale strip of light across the living room floor. The house remained quiet, suspended in that fragile space between night and day where everything felt momentarily still. He woke with a start. For a split second, panic surged through him. The couch wasn't familiar. The ceiling wasn't his. His body tensed, muscles ready to react, before memory caught up. He wasn't in danger. Not here. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. The blanket had slipped during the night, and he pulled it back up, sitting upright as his eyes adjusted to the light. He hadn't slept deeply, but it was enough. Enough to remind him what rest felt like. He checked the time on his phone. Early. Too early to justify moving around someone else's house. He set the phone back down and listened. No movement. No voices. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of a city waking up. He stood quietly, careful not to make noise, and gathered his jacket from the chair. It was dry now. Someone must have moved it while he slept. That realization made his chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. She had checked on him. He didn't know how to feel about that. He walked toward the window, staring out at the street below. Cars passed occasionally. People moved with purpose, heading somewhere, belonging somewhere. The normal rhythm of life continued, indifferent to the fact that his own had cracked open the night before. He wondered how many of them were pretending everything was fine. Behind him, a door opened softly. He turned. She stood at the end of the hallway, hair slightly messy, face bare of pretense. She looked tired, but calm. Like someone who had accepted the morning instead of fighting it. "Did I wake you?" she asked. "No," he said quickly. "I was already up." She nodded, walking toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Yes," he answered without hesitation, then added, "if that's okay." She gave him a small look. Not amused. Just understanding. "You don't need permission for coffee," she said. He followed her at a respectful distance, watching as she moved through the kitchen with quiet familiarity. The simple routine, filling the kettle, setting out mugs, felt strangely intimate. Domestic. He leaned against the counter, unsure what to do with his hands again. "You can sit," she said, nodding toward the table. He obeyed, resting his forearms on the surface, fingers interlaced. The chair creaked softly beneath him. Everything here felt solid, grounded. She handed him a mug. Steam curled upward between them. She handed him a mug. Steam curled upward between them. "Thank you," he said. They sat in silence for a while, sipping slowly. The coffee was strong. Exactly what he needed. "You didn't sleep much," she said eventually. He didn't deny it. "I'm not used to quiet." She glanced at him. "What are you used to?" He considered the question. "Noise," he said. "Conflict. Always being alert." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." The word came out before he could soften it. She watched him carefully now, like she was piecing together a picture from incomplete fragments. "You don't have to leave right away," she said after a moment. "If you need time." He stiffened slightly. "I don't want to overstay." "You won't," she interrupted gently. "I wouldn't have offered if I didn't mean it." He nodded, absorbing the reassurance. "Thank you," he said again, "for letting me stay. I'll figure something out today." She leaned back in her chair. "Do you have a plan?" He hesitated. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I will." She accepted that answer, even though they both knew it wasn't entirely convincing. They finished their coffee. She stood to rinse her mug, and he followed suit, mimicking her movements. The rhythm felt almost normal. Too normal. "I need to head out later," she said. "Work?" "Of course," he replied. "I can be gone before then." She paused, then shook her head. "You don't need to rush. Lock the door when you leave." That startled him. "You trust me?" he asked before he could stop himself. She met his eyes. "Yes." The word landed heavier than he expected. Trust wasn't something he was accustomed to receiving without conditions. "Okay," he said quietly. She grabbed her keys and bag, then stopped at the door. "One more thing," she said. He looked up. "You're safe here," she added. "At least for today." Then she left. The door closed softly behind her, leaving him alone in the house once more. But this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like space. He sat back down at the table, staring into nothing, letting the weight of her words sink in. Safe. He hadn't felt that in a long time. And as the morning light filled the room completely, he realized something that unsettled him more than the chaos he'd left behind. This quiet night, the one meant to pass without consequence, had already begun to change him. And nights like that never stayed quiet for long. The house felt different once she left. Not empty, just quieter in a way that made him aware of himself. Every step he took echoed softly. Every movement reminded him he was a guest in someone else's carefully ordered life. He cleaned the mug he'd used, drying it with more care than necessary before placing it back exactly where he'd found it. He straightened the blanket on the couch, smoothed the pillow, and stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. He wasn't used to being still. When life was chaotic, stillness felt dangerous. It gave thoughts room to surface, questions space to breathe. He sat down again, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The morning light was stronger now, revealing details he hadn't noticed the night before. Framed photos on the wall, neatly arranged books on the shelf, a small plant by the window that looked carefully tended. This was a life built with intention. And he didn't fit into it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He stiffened instantly, heart jumping before he even pulled it out. Instinct told him it would be bad news. It wasn't a call, just a message. A name he hadn't expected to see. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering, chest tightening. The words were short, cold, final. "You need to come get your things. Today." No apology. No explanation. Just confirmation that what he'd lost the night before wasn't temporary. He locked the phone and slipped it back into his pocket, jaw tightening as he leaned back against the couch. The room suddenly felt smaller. So that was it. He had known it was coming. Had felt it building long before it finally collapsed. Still, seeing it written down made it real in a way his mind hadn't fully accepted yet. He stood and paced slowly, careful not to disturb anything. His thoughts ran in circles, where he would go, who he could call, how long he could pretend this didn't hurt. He didn't hear the door open. "Hey!" Her voice startled him. He turned quickly, then immediately forced himself to relax. She stood just inside the doorway, keys in hand, expression unreadable. "I forgot my charger," she said. "Didn't mean to scare you." "You didn't," he replied, though his heart was still racing. She noticed. "You okay?" she asked. He considered lying. It would have been easy. Automatic. But something in her tone, open, unguarded, made it harder to fall back into old habits. He nodded once. "Yeah. Just thinking." She set her bag down and leaned lightly against the counter, studying him in a way that wasn't intrusive, just attentive. "You don't strike me as someone who thinks quietly," she said. He let out a short breath. "I usually don't. What's different today?" He hesitated. There it was again. That moment where he could choose silence or risk honesty. "I got a message," he said finally. She waited. "It confirmed what I already knew," he continued. "That I don't have a place to go back to." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened. "I'm sorry," she said. The words landed deeper than he expected. "I'll be fine," he replied automatically. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "You don't have to say that here." He swallowed. "I don't really know how not to," he admitted. That earned a small, understanding nod. She crossed the room and picked up her charger, then paused, clearly debating something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he replied. "I don't promise I'll answer well." "That's fair," she said. "Why didn't you call anyone last night?" The question cut sharper than he expected. He looked away, staring at the window. "Because I didn't want to be a problem." She frowned slightly. "Needing help doesn't make you a problem." He shook his head. "It does when people only value you for what you provide." She studied him now, really studied him. "Who taught you that?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, a lot of people had. Past relationships. Family expectations. Moments where he'd reached out and learned the hard way that vulnerability came with a cost. "I learned early that being useful kept people around," he said slowly. "Being honest didn't." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. "That sounds lonely," she said. He gave a half smile. "You get used to it." "No," she replied firmly. "You survive it." "That's different." The distinction caught him off guard. She stepped closer, still giving him space, but no longer distant. She stepped closer, still giving him space, but no longer distant. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she added. "Not here." Something in his chest shifted. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since he knocked on her door, he felt something crack, not pain, but release. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. She nodded. "Then don't try to learn all at once." They stood there, suspended in a moment neither of them had expected when the day began. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to sleep, leave quietly, and disappear from her life. Instead, he was standing in her kitchen, letting pieces of himself show he'd spent years hiding. "I should let you get back to work," he said eventually. She nodded, picking up her bag again. "I'll be back later." She hesitated at the door. "And for what it's worth," she added, "you don't feel like a burden to me." Then she left again. This time, the door closing didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause. He sat down slowly, letting her words echo in his mind. Conversations like that, the quiet, honest ones, were dangerous. Because once you let someone see you clearly, there was no going back to pretending you were untouched. And deep down, he knew something important had already happened. The night that was supposed to stay quiet had opened a door neither of them could close again. The hours dragged after she left. Time didn't move the way it normally did. It stretched, slowed, then seemed to fold in on itself, leaving him suspended in a quiet he didn't know how to fill. He paced the living room, then stopped. Sat down, then stood again. Every attempt to distract himself failed. Eventually, he sank back onto the couch and stared at the floor. Her words echoed in his mind. "You don't feel like a burden to me." He didn't know what to do with that. Burden had been the role he learned to avoid at all costs. He had watched what happened to people who needed too much. How they were slowly edged out. Spoken about with patience on the surface and resentment underneath. So he became useful, reliable, strong. And now that armor was cracking. He pulled his phone out again, turning it over in his hands like it might bite him. There were messages he hadn't opened. Calls he hadn't returned. Names he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore forever. He opened the thread from earlier. No new messages. Just the same blunt demand staring back at him. Come get your things. Today. He closed his eyes. What she didn't know, what almost no one knew, was how close he'd come to losing everything long before this. This wasn't just about one night, or one argument, or one bad decision. This had been building for years. He had ignored signs he shouldn't have. Red flags he explained away because facing them would have meant admitting he was wrong. About people. About promises. About himself. He'd invested everything, time, money, loyalty, into something he believed would last. Something he thought was solid. Instead, it hollowed him out. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, pressing his palms into his eyes. The memory surfaced uninvited. The moment he realized he was being blamed for choices he hadn't made. The moment he understood he was no longer needed, only convenient to discard. His jaw tightened. He had walked out before things turned uglier. Before words became weapons that couldn't be taken back. He had grabbed only what he could carry, left everything else behind like it didn't matter. But it did matter. It all mattered. He straightened suddenly, breath-catching. This quiet house, this temporary refuge, was delaying the truth he'd been avoiding. He had nowhere to go after today. The realization hit him hard, settling deep in his chest. He could leave now. Thank her again. Disappear. Figure it out the way he always had. Sleep in his car. Call a coworker. Make excuses. But something stopped him. Because for the first time in a long while, someone had seen him without expectations attached. She hadn't asked what he could offer. She hadn't demanded explanations. She had simply made space. That terrified him more than being alone. The door unlocked in the late afternoon. He looked up instantly. She stepped inside, kicking off her shoes, her posture tired but relaxed. She froze when she noticed him watching. "You're still here," she said. He nodded. "I hope that's okay." "It is," she replied. "I told you it would be." She set her bag down and glanced around, then back at him. "You didn't move anything," she observed. He shrugged. "Didn't feel right." That earned a faint smile. She went to the kitchen, filling a glass with water. He watched her, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. His chest felt tight again, but not with panic this time. With decision. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She paused, then turned toward him. "Okay." He stood slowly, like sudden movement might break the moment. "I didn't just lose a place to sleep," he continued. "I lost everything I built around it." She didn't interrupt. "I stayed longer than I should have," he admitted. "Believed promises that weren't meant to be kept. I thought if I worked harder, gave more, it would fix things." He laughed quietly, bitterly. "It didn't." She crossed her arms lightly, listening. "I didn't tell you last night because I wasn't ready to admit it out loud," he said. "But I don't have a backup plan. After today, I don't have a home." The words felt heavy once spoken, but also freeing. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you for telling me." "I'm not asking to stay," he added quickly. "I just didn't want you thinking this was simple." She studied him, eyes thoughtful. "I never thought it was simple," she said. Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was processing. "You can stay tonight," she said eventually. "We'll talk about tomorrow later." He shook his head slightly. "I don't want to take advantage." She stepped closer, firm but calm. Letting someone stay when they're struggling isn't being taken advantage of, she said. It's being human. He looked at her, emotions pressing dangerously close to the surface. I don't want you to regret this, he said quietly. She held his gaze. I won't. Something shifted then, not dramatically, not romantically, but fundamentally. He nodded once. Okay. She turned back toward the kitchen. Dinner. He blinked. You don't have to, I know, she said. I want to. That simple sentence hit him harder than any argument ever had. As she moved around the kitchen, he sat back down, staring at the floor again, but this time, the weight in his chest felt different. The truth he'd been avoiding was finally out in the open. And once the truth surfaced, there was no pretending this was just a place to sleep. This wasn't a pause anymore. It was the beginning of something he didn't know how to prepare for and couldn't walk away from without losing something important. Dinner passed quietly, but not awkwardly. They ate at the small table near the kitchen window, the sky outside slowly darkening as the day slipped away. The food was simple, nothing fancy, but it carried a kind of comfort he hadn't realized he'd been missing. A normal moment. Shared space without expectations. He hadn't eaten much in the last 24 hours. Still, he forced himself to slow down, mindful not to seem desperate. Old habits were hard to break. She noticed anyway. You don't have to ration, she said lightly. There's more. He paused, then nodded. Thanks. They cleaned up together. He insisted on washing the dishes. She let him, standing nearby, drying and stacking them without speaking much. The rhythm felt strangely natural, like something they'd done before in another life. Afterward, he retreated back to the couch, pulling the blanket over his legs again. She sat in the chair across from him, scrolling briefly on her phone before setting it aside. You look tense, she said. He gave a faint smile. I feel exposed. She tilted her head. From telling me the truth? Yes, he admitted. I'm not good at letting people see the parts of my life that aren't finished. She nodded slowly. Most people aren't. Silence returned, but it didn't last long. A sudden knock echoed through the apartment. Sharp. Insistent. His body reacted before his mind could. He stiffened, heart slamming into his ribs, breath catching as his eyes locked onto the door. Every muscle tensed like he was bracing for impact. She noticed instantly. You weren't expecting anyone, were you? She asked. He shook his head, slowly. The knock came again, louder this time. He swallowed hard. No, he said. I wasn't. She stood, cautious now. I'll check. No, he said quickly, then softened his tone. Please. Let me. She hesitated, then nodded. He stood, moving carefully toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway light outside cast shadows under the doorframe, shadows that stirred something deep and uncomfortable inside him. He recognized that knock. He reached the door and looked through the peephole. His stomach dropped. The past stood on the other side. A man he hadn't seen in months. Someone he'd once trusted. Someone who had helped unravel his life piece by piece while pretending to hold it together. The knock came again, impatient now. Open up, the voice said. I know you're in there. His pulse roared in his ears. She stood a few steps behind him, tension visible in her posture. Who is it? She asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. Someone I hoped I'd never have to deal with again, he finally said. The knock turned into a sharp pound. We need to talk, the voice continued. You don't get to disappear like that. His jaw clenched. Disappear. as if walking away from betrayal was the same as running. He opened the door just enough to keep the chain in place. "What do you want?" he asked. The man smirked. "That's no way to greet someone you owe." "I don't owe you anything," he replied evenly. "You walked out," the man snapped. "Left things unfinished." He felt the familiar pull of guilt trying to take hold, the same tactic that had kept him trapped for so long. "I left because you crossed a line," he said. "And you know it." The man's expression darkened. "You don't get to rewrite what happened." Before he could respond, the man's gaze shifted past him toward the interior of the apartment. "Oh," he said slowly. "So this is where you landed." Something cold settled in his chest. "This has nothing to do with her," he said sharply. "Doesn't look that way," the man replied, voice dripping with implication. "Didn't take you long." She stepped forward then, placing herself just behind him, not interfering, but present. "You need to leave," she said calmly. "Now." The man scoffed. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who knows when a conversation is over," she replied. The tension snapped tight, like a wire pulled too far. He felt anger rise, not explosive, but steady, protective. "You're not welcome here," he said. "If you have something to say it now." The man leaned closer to the door. "You think walking away makes you innocent? You were part of this. You benefited." His hands curled into fists. "I paid my price," he said. "More than once." "Then you won't mind settling what's left," the man replied. "I'm done," he said quietly. "That includes you." For a moment, it looked like the man might push harder, might make a scene. Then, just as suddenly, he stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "You can't hide forever." He turned and walked away, footsteps fading down the hall. The door clicked shut. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy. He stood there, unmoving, staring at the door like it might open again. She touched his arm gently. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded once, but it was a lie. "That was part of what I walked away from," he said. "The control, the manipulation, the way they made me feel responsible for their choices." She listened, eyes steady. "You didn't deserve that," she said. The words hit him harder than the confrontation itself. "I know," he replied quietly. "I just wish I'd known sooner." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the past lingering in the room. Whatever he'd buried wasn't done with him yet. And he knew deep down that this was only the beginning of the storm. The night arrived too fast. The sky outside had darkened into a thick, inky black, and the apartment felt smaller, enclosed, like the walls were pressing inward. Every sound seemed louder: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, the occasional creak of the building settling. He could feel the tension in the air, and it wasn't coming from him alone. She moved around the apartment with cautious efficiency, flipping on a lamp here, closing a cabinet there, but there was an underlying wariness in her posture. She wasn't used to danger showing up at her door, and yet, now it had, and he could sense her unease just as clearly as his own. He sat on the edge of the couch, blanket loosely draped over his lap. His phone rested on the table, screen dark, untouched, yet he could feel the weight of it like a promise of threats still lingering. The man from earlier hadn't left him entirely. The confrontation had opened something he'd tried to lock away for months, a past that refused to stay buried. A sudden knock at the door froze him in place. Not the polite, measured knock from before, but sharp, insistent, aggressive, demanding attention rather than seeking entry. His pulse jumped. His muscles tensed instinctively. He had faced threats before, but never so directly. Not here, not in this quiet apartment, not with someone else's safety dangling as a consequence. "Stay behind me," he said, voice low but steady, more to himself than to her. She didn't argue, but she froze, eyes wide. She understood without words. He moved to the door, careful not to make any sudden movements that might escalate the situation. Every step felt heavy, deliberate, as if the floor itself had grown sticky with tension. "Who is it?" she asked softly, though her voice carried more fear now than before. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed his ear to the door, listening. The knocks continued hard, relentless, echoing in the quiet apartment. Then came a voice, low and threatening. "You there? I know you're inside. Open up." It wasn't a demand. It was a warning. A challenge. He exhaled slowly, forcing his body to calm, forcing his mind to focus. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear, to retreat into the shadows and avoid confrontation entirely. But he couldn't, not this time. Not when she was here. Not when the past had finally caught up with him. He reached for the chain lock and disengaged it carefully, not giving the man outside any opportunity to push forward. He opened the door a fraction. The man's face appeared, partially hidden in the dim light of the hallway. There was anger there, sharp and deliberate. Threat. Resentment. A need to assert control. "You think you can hide here," the man said. "You can't run forever." "I'm not running," he said, keeping his tone even, controlled. "I'm done running from you." The man sneered, a motion that was meant to provoke fear, to unsettle, but it only hardened him. "You've got some nerve," the man said, taking a step closer. "After everything, after all you left behind, showing up here like nothing happened." "I didn't come here to fight," he interrupted firmly. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Now leave." There was a pause. Tension thickened, heavy and suffocating. The man's eyes darted, scanning the apartment, assessing the surroundings, sizing up not just him, but the presence behind him. She stepped forward, hands slightly raised, not aggressive, just steady. "Enough," she said, voice clear, commanding. "You will leave. Now." The man's gaze flickered toward her. A smirk formed, but it didn't reach his eyes. He measured her, weighing whether she was a threat. Then he let out a low laugh, sharp and bitter. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, but there was hesitation now, a crack in his confidence. That hesitation was all he needed. "I said leave," he repeated, more firmly this time, stepping slightly in front of her. His body was rigid, ready. Every nerve alert, every sense honed to the danger standing at the threshold. The man hesitated. Then, with a sharp turn, he backed down the hall, muttering threats that dissolved into the distance. The pounding of his footsteps faded. Silence returned, almost painfully quiet. He let the door close fully, re-engaged the lock, and exhaled sharply. His hands were trembling slightly, but his jaw was set. She approached slowly, concern written across her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, softly. He nodded, but the truth was, the adrenaline still lingered, his body buzzing, his mind racing. He wasn't just angry or scared. He was aware now, more than ever, of the vulnerability that came with letting someone else into his life. "This isn't over," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Not yet." She didn't argue. She merely stood beside him, presence calm, grounding, offering quiet support. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to relax, not completely, but enough to know he wasn't alone in facing this danger. The shadows of his past had arrived. The threat was real. And yet, in this small, quiet apartment, a fragile sense of trust had begun to form. The night had turned dangerous, but it had also reminded him that some risks were worth taking. That some battles were easier faced with someone else by your side. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face what was coming next. Morning came like a slow invasion, soft light spilling through the curtains and across the floor, illuminating the quiet aftermath of the night. The apartment felt smaller now, tighter, almost claustrophobic, though it was the same space he'd occupied yesterday. Everything seemed sharper, the corners of the furniture, the edge of the coffee table, the light flickering slightly on the walls. It wasn't just the room that had changed. It was him. He had changed. He sat on the couch, blanket draped loosely over his shoulders, staring at the floor. His mind replayed the events from the night before in endless loops. The confrontation at the door, the sharp words, the subtle but undeniable tension that had hung in the apartment like a thick fog. Even as he tried to calm himself, the adrenaline still throbbed faintly in his chest. The remnants of fear lingered, stubborn and unrelenting. She was in the kitchen, moving quietly, preparing breakfast with careful motions. Each sound, knife against cutting board, the faint hum of the kettle, was amplified in the stillness. He didn't know if it was because he was tense or because the apartment had become a cage where every movement mattered. He reached for the coffee mug left from last night, but stopped midway, realizing he hadn't slept properly. He rubbed his face, letting his hands run through his hair, trying to steady himself. Thoughts of what he would do today clawed at the edges of his mind. There was no plan, no safety net. Only uncertainty, as wide and empty as the street outside. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative, though carrying a weight of concern he hadn't expected. He hesitated. "Not really," he admitted, voice low. "I'll figure it out." "Figure it out," she echoed, almost questioning the phrase. "What does that mean?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw more than curiosity. He saw caution, empathy, and something unspoken that made his chest tighten. "It means I'll survive. Somehow." She studied him for a long moment, and he felt the quiet scrutiny prickling at his skin. She wasn't judgmental, but she was searching, trying to understand the man who had arrived at her door in the middle of a storm and stayed through the night. The silence stretched. Not heavy exactly, but thick with implication. Neither of them moved immediately, both of them acutely aware of the shared tension that had begun forming in the apartment hours before. Finally, she spoke, breaking the fragile stillness. "You can't stay here forever." He let out a slow, humorless laugh. "No, of course not." "You can't," she repeated, more firmly this time, as if she wanted to make sure he heard the truth in her words. "At some point, reality comes back. Responsibilities. People expecting things. And whatever it is you're running from, it won't wait." He nodded. He knew she was right. And yet, part of him rebelled against the idea that reality had any claim over him at all. The past year had been a lesson in how easily the world could take from him, twist him, strip him of stability until nothing remained. And now, this brief refuge, her apartment, her kindness was becoming a rare, fragile lifeline. He drank the coffee she had made, letting the warmth seep into his hands. He stared into the mug, watching the swirling liquid, trying to find some kind of grounding in the simple motion. The reality outside, though, waited patiently, inevitable. The knock came again, different this time. Quieter, deliberate, calculated. Unlike last night, it wasn't a storming threat. It was something worse, a reminder that the past wasn't done with him. He stiffened, coffee halfway to his lips. The blood drained slightly from his face. She noticed. "Who is it?" she asked. He swallowed, tension rolling up his spine. "Someone I hoped I wouldn't see again," he admitted. The words tasted bitter. True. Vulnerable. The door opened just enough to reveal a figure leaning against the frame, a casual menace hiding something sharper beneath. "Morning," the man said, voice deceptively calm. "We need to talk. Now." The air grew thick, oppressive. He stepped forward, blanket falling from his shoulders. "Not here. Leave." "I don't think so," the man said, smirking. His eyes scanned the apartment, resting momentarily on her, assessing. "Seems you've made a friend." "I'm not your concern," he said, voice low, deadly calm. The man's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by something darker, more patient. "I think it is," he replied. "Everything that happened last night matters. And you've been avoiding it." He tensed, remembering the confrontation from the previous night. And then he realized something crucial. Avoidance hadn't saved him. Only facing it, here, now, might keep him safe. She stepped behind him again, but this time, she didn't speak. She simply observed, ready to act if necessary, and he felt a strange warmth, trust, in its quietest, most powerful form. The man leaned closer to the doorframe. "You think you can just disappear, start over? I'll make sure you don't get the chance." He exhaled slowly, focusing. "I'm done running from this," he said. "You're not taking anything else from me." There was silence, the kind that presses against the ribs and makes your chest ache. The man's eyes narrowed. He weighed his next move, then, finally, backed down, retreating slowly down the hall, muttering threats that faded into the building's corridors. He closed the door, locking it carefully. His chest heaved. Adrenaline still thrummed in his veins. She approached, calm but concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked, softly. "I will be," he said, voice steadying. "But the past, it doesn't just disappear." "No," she agreed. "But facing it doesn't mean you have to face it alone." He nodded, taking in the words. For a moment, the apartment felt safe again. Fragile. Temporary. But safe enough to start planning the next steps. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, but inside, a quiet reckoning had begun. The past had arrived. The present demanded attention. And neither of them could ignore what was coming next. Morning came like a slow invasion, soft light spilling through the curtains and across the floor, illuminating the quiet aftermath of the night. The apartment felt smaller now, tighter, almost claustrophobic, though it was the same space he'd occupied yesterday. Everything seemed sharper: the corners of the furniture, the edge of the coffee table, the light flickering slightly on the walls. It wasn't just the room that had changed. It was him. He had changed. He sat on the couch, blanket draped loosely over his shoulders, staring at the floor. His mind replayed the events from the night before in endless loops: the confrontation at the door, the sharp words, the subtle but undeniable tension that had hung in the apartment like a thick fog. Even as he tried to calm himself, the adrenaline still throbbed faintly in his chest. The remnants of fear lingered, stubborn and unrelenting. She was in the kitchen, moving quietly, preparing breakfast with careful motions. Each sound: knife against cutting board, the faint hum of the kettle was amplified in the stillness. He didn't know if it was because he was tense or because the apartment had become a cage where every movement mattered. He reached for the coffee mug left from last night, but stopped midway, realizing he hadn't slept properly. He rubbed his face, letting his hands run through his hair, trying to steady himself. Thoughts of what he would do today clawed at the edges of his mind. There was no plan, no safety net. Only uncertainty, as wide and empty as the street outside. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative, though carrying a weight of concern he hadn't expected. He hesitated. "Not really," he admitted, voice low. "I'll figure it out." "Figure it out," she echoed, almost questioning the phrase. "What does that mean?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw more than curiosity. He saw caution, empathy, and something unspoken that made his chest tighten. "It means I'll survive. Somehow." She studied him for a long moment, and he felt the quiet scrutiny prickling at his skin. She wasn't judgmental, but she was searching, trying to understand the man who had arrived at her door in the middle of a storm and stayed through the night. The silence stretched. Not heavy exactly, but thick with implication. Neither of them moved immediately, both of them acutely aware of the shared tension that had begun forming in the apartment hours before. Finally, she spoke, breaking the fragile stillness. "You can't stay here forever." He let out a slow, humorless laugh. "No. Of course not." "You can't," she repeated, more firmly this time, as if she wanted to make sure he heard the truth in her words. "At some point, reality comes back. Responsibilities. People expecting things. And whatever it is you're running from, it won't wait." He nodded. He knew she was right. And yet, part of him rebelled against the idea that reality had any claim over him at all. The past year had been a lesson in how easily the world could take from him, twist him, strip him of stability until nothing remained. And now, this brief refuge, her apartment, her kindness, was becoming a rare, fragile lifeline. He drank the coffee she had made, letting the warmth seep into his hands. He stared into the mug, watching the swirling liquid, trying to find some kind of grounding in the simple motion. The reality outside, though, waited patiently, inevitable. The knock came again, different this time, quieter, deliberate, calculated. Unlike last night, it wasn't a storming threat, it was something worse, a reminder that the past wasn't done with him. He stiffened, coffee halfway to his lips. The blood drained slightly from his face. She noticed. "Who is it?" she asked. He swallowed, tension rolling up his spine. "Someone I hoped I wouldn't see again," he admitted. The words tasted bitter. True. Vulnerable. The door opened just enough to reveal a figure leaning against the frame, a casual menace hiding something sharper beneath. "Morning," the man said, voice deceptively calm. "We need to talk. Now." The air grew thick, oppressive. He stepped forward, blanket falling from his shoulders. "Not here. Leave." "I don't think so," the man said, smirking. His eyes scanned the apartment, resting momentarily on her, assessing. "Seems you've made a friend." "I'm not your concern," he said, voice low, deadly calm. The man's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by something darker, more patient. "I think it is," he replied. "Everything that happened last night matters. And you've been avoiding it." He tensed, remembering the confrontation from the previous night. And then he realized something crucial. Avoidance hadn't saved him. Only facing it, here, now, might keep him safe. She stepped behind him again, but this time, she didn't speak. She simply observed, ready to act if necessary, and he felt a strange warmth trust, in its quietest, most powerful form. The man leaned closer to the doorframe. "You think you can just disappear, start over? I'll make sure you don't get the chance." He exhaled slowly, focusing. "I'm done running from this," he said. "You're not taking anything else from me." There was silence, the kind that presses against the ribs and makes your chest ache. The man's eyes narrowed. He weighed his next move, then, finally, backed down, retreating slowly down the hall, muttering threats that faded into the building's corridors. He closed the door, locking it carefully. His chest heaved. Adrenaline still thrummed in his veins. She approached, calm but concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked, softly. "I will be," he said, voice steadying. "But the past, it doesn't just disappear." "No," she agreed. "But facing it doesn't mean you have to face it alone." He nodded, taking in the words. For a moment, the apartment felt safe again. Fragile. Temporary. But safe enough to start planning the next steps. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, but inside, a quiet reckoning had begun. The past had arrived. The present demanded attention. And neither of them could ignore what was coming next. The day passed in a haze of quiet anxiety. He moved through the apartment mechanically, trying to busy himself with tasks that now seemed trivial. Wiping surfaces, stacking books, rearranging cushions. Each motion was precise, deliberate, as though control over these small things could offset the chaos that loomed just outside the walls. She watched him from the kitchen, occasionally offering small comments or questions that he answered minimally, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Both knew the encounter with the man outside the door had changed everything. It wasn't just an intrusion, it was a revelation. Every step he took reminded him of the life he'd lost, of the obligations and failures he'd left behind, and of the truth he had refused to confront until now. He paused at the window, staring out at the street below. Cars passed lazily, people walking as though nothing in their world could touch them. He envied them, briefly, for their simplicity, for the normalcy that now felt like a foreign language. A soft knock at the door broke the tension. Not loud, not threatening, but firm. Intentional. Deliberate. He froze. Every muscle tensed. "It's open," he said cautiously. The door cracked open just enough to reveal an envelope shoved through the gap. No one visible. He picked it up, inspecting it carefully. No name. No markings other than his own. He felt a tightening in his chest as he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar, precise, controlled. The words hit him like a cold wave. "We know what you've done. You can't hide forever. Meet us tonight, or the consequences will reach everyone you care about." He dropped the paper onto the table, his fingers trembling slightly. She had come closer, eyes wide. "What is it?" He hesitated, trying to steady his voice. "It's someone from my past. They've found me." "Found you?" she asked. "Yes," he said quietly, jaw tight. "And they know things I've been trying to bury." Her expression shifted. Concern deepened, mingled with a quiet resolve. "So what do you plan to do?" He exhaled slowly, running his hand down his face. "I don't have a choice. I need to face this. Tonight." She stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to do it alone." He turned to her, studying the calm determination in her eyes. There was trust there, trust he hadn't allowed himself to accept before. And yet, the fear of the unknown gnawed at him, a predator circling the edges of his mind. "I can't risk you," he said quietly. "You're already risking me by facing it alone," she countered. "We'll handle it together." He swallowed hard. Her words carried weight he hadn't anticipated. He was used to handling threats alone, to walking into storms without anyone knowing, without anyone seeing the cracks forming in his armor. But now, for the first time, He had to accept that someone else's presence could be a shield rather than a weakness. The hours crawled by. He rehearsed every possible scenario, ran through countless outcomes in his head, but nothing could prepare him for what the evening might bring. Every tick of the clock pushed the tension higher, every shadow in the apartment whispering of danger and exposure. When night finally arrived, darkness cloaked the city outside. The apartment lights were dim, casting long shadows that mirrored the unease in his mind. The envelope had been set aside, but the threat it contained was now inescapable. The confrontation with the man last night had been a prelude. Tonight would reveal the depth of secrets he had fought to conceal. She stood near the window, her presence calm, a quiet reminder that he was not entirely alone. He glanced at her once, then back at the envelope on the table. "We need a plan," she said. He nodded, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. "We meet them on my terms, not theirs." Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "Then we prepare." For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope amid the tension. Facing the past was inevitable. Facing it with someone else, someone who believed in him despite the chaos, was new, untested, and dangerous. The envelope lay between them, a symbol of all that was unresolved. Secrets, lies, betrayals, consequences. And now, the choice was no longer his alone. Together they would face the night, but nothing in the past or the shadows lurking just beyond the door would make it easy. Because secrets, once exposed, had a way of breaking the strongest walls, and he was about to learn just how far those walls could crumble. Night had swallowed the city whole. Streetlights flickered along empty sidewalks, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted against the walls. The apartment felt smaller, every corner sharper, every sound amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. He stood near the window, hands gripping the sill, staring out at the darkness beyond. The envelope had been read. Its threat had been digested. And now, the reality of what awaited outside pressed against him like an unrelenting weight. She was beside him, silent, but her presence was steady, a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. He appreciated it, even though he would never admit how much it mattered. "You sure about this?" she asked, voice low, careful. He didn't answer immediately. He could feel the tension coiling in his chest, the familiar fear that had accompanied him through every confrontation of his past. It wasn't just fear, it was anticipation, the knowledge that tonight could change everything, for better or worse. "I have to," he finally said. "No more running. No more hiding. I can't let them control my life anymore." She nodded, though her expression betrayed her concern. "We do this together." He glanced at her, just once, then squared his shoulders and opened the door. Darkness greeted him like an old enemy. The hallway was empty, silent, except for a faint whisper of movement in the distance. And then he saw them. 3 figures, emerging from the shadows, their presence deliberate, menacing. Each step they took was measured, controlled, a clear assertion of dominance. He recognized the tallest one immediately, someone who had haunted his life for months, a constant reminder of everything he'd lost. The others were unknown, faceless threats lurking in the dark, their intentions clear without a word spoken. He stepped forward, hands slightly raised, signaling caution. "I don't want trouble," he said, voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. "Trouble?" the tallest man echoed, a sinister smirk forming. "You've had plenty of that already. Now it's time to settle accounts." The others closed in, surrounding him and her in a semicircle. Every instinct screamed for him to retreat, to vanish into the night, but he knew that running wasn't an option. Not tonight. Not when the stakes had escalated to this point. You've been hiding, the man continued, voice low, dangerous, thinking you could escape the consequences of your actions. But you can't. Not anymore. He clenched his fists, muscles tight. I didn't hide to hurt anyone, he said. I hid to survive. And now if you're here, it's because you failed to let the past stay in the past. The man's eyes glinted with fury. Don't try to lecture me. You owe. And tonight, you pay. A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. He could feel the sweat forming along his spine, could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Every second stretched, elongated, until it felt like the night itself had slowed down, holding its breath. She stepped slightly forward, a hand on his arm. We don't have to do this, she said. Walk away now, and you can leave without bloodshed. He shook his head slowly. I can't. Not anymore. The tallest man's smirk widened. Brave words for someone standing alone. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a need to defend not just himself but her. I'm not alone, he said firmly. For a moment, the tension shifted, subtle but significant. The man's gaze flicked toward her, reassessing. There was a pause, a fragile hesitation. Then the smallest of the three lunged forward, sudden, aggressive. He reacted instantly, stepping between her and the threat, a surge of instinct guiding his every move. The confrontation that had loomed for days, weeks, months, had finally arrived. Shouts broke the night's fragile quiet. The other two moved, circling, testing, waiting for an opening. Every movement, every breath, every decision mattered. One misstep could cost him everything he had fought to protect. Stay behind me, he barked, voice sharp, controlled. She obeyed, but she didn't hide. Her presence was calm, steady, grounding him amidst the chaos. He drew a deep breath, preparing for what he knew could be the longest, most dangerous night of his life. The first strike came fast, a blur of motion he barely had time to anticipate. He blocked, countered, pivoted. Adrenaline sharpened his senses. The past was here, embodied in every movement of these three men. And yet, he refused to crumble. Every action was precise, every step deliberate, as though his survival depended on it because it did. The air around them was electric. The tension thickened until it felt like the walls themselves would explode. Shadows danced on the walls, flickering in the dim light, and every sound, grunt, scrape, shuffling footstep felt amplified. And then, amidst the chaos, he realized something. This night wasn't just about him. It was about proving, finally, that he could protect what mattered. That he could face the storm and not be destroyed. The fight continued, brutal, precise, and exhausting. Time seemed meaningless. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the fragile trust that had formed between them, the quiet bond that had begun to anchor him when everything else had fallen away. And then, in the middle of the chaos, a sharp, deliberate movement, one of the men slipped, stumbled, revealing a dangerous opening. He froze, recognizing the moment instantly. Everything hung in the balance. One wrong move, one hesitation, and the consequences would reach far beyond him. The night had become more than a confrontation. It had become a crucible, testing not just his strength but his judgment, his instincts, his very survival. And as he locked eyes with the tallest man, every muscle coiled, heart racing, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The first chapter of the night's reckoning was over, but the war was far from done. The apartment was quiet, almost oppressively so, after the confrontation. He sank onto the couch, body trembling with exhaustion, adrenaline still pounding in his veins like a second heartbeat. The sweat clung to his skin, hair matted, clothes slightly torn from the scuffle. Every nerve screamed at him to move, to stay alert, but there was nowhere to go. The danger had receded for now, but the echoes of it lingered, filling every corner of the room. She sat across from him, silent but watchful. Her presence was calm, almost unnervingly so. She hadn't intervened physically, yet her steady gaze felt like a lifeline he hadn't realized he needed. Her hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers loosely intertwined, and he watched her for a long moment before meeting her eyes. "You're okay?" she asked softly, concern etched into every word. He nodded, though the truth was more complicated than a simple affirmation. "I will be," he said quietly. "Just tired." She didn't push further. Instead, she got up and moved toward the kitchen, her movements deliberate but careful, making coffee without breaking the fragile silence. The aroma slowly filled the room, a mundane comfort that contrasted sharply with the violence that had erupted only hours before. He let out a slow breath, closing his eyes for a moment. The fight had been a reminder of everything he'd been running from, not just people, not just threats, but the mistakes, the betrayals, the choices he'd tried to bury deep enough that no one could find them. He set the phone down slowly, jaw tight, fists clenching at his sides. "This isn't done," he said. She nodded, eyes steady. "Then we keep preparing. Together." For the first time, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. The fight wasn't just about survival. It was about trust. About letting someone stand with you, even when everything else in the world threatened to collapse. And as the night deepened outside, shadows stretching across the walls, he realized that the coming battle would test everything he had learned, everything he had hidden, and every bond he was beginning to form. The past had arrived. The present demanded vigilance. And the future, uncertain, dangerous, and full of potential, was waiting for him to step into it. The city outside had gone silent, but inside, the apartment felt electric. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound amplified, every breath weighted with anticipation. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. Every moment since the confrontation had been spent in a tense preparation, each movement deliberate, each decision calculated. She moved around the apartment with quiet efficiency, checking locks, windows, even the doors leading to the hallway. He watched her, marveling at her calm in the midst of escalating danger. It wasn't bravery in the reckless sense. It was measured, controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos that had dominated his life for so long. He paced the living room, back and forth, trying to focus, trying to prepare for what he knew was inevitable. The envelope, the knocks, the threats, they were all pieces of a storm that had finally caught up with him. And he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Hiding hadn't worked, and now the past was crashing in with a force he could no longer deflect. A knock came at the door, deliberate and slow this time. Not aggressive, but certain. It carried the weight of inevitability. He froze. "Stay behind me," he whispered, voice low but firm. She obeyed without question, standing just a step back, eyes alert, muscles coiled like a spring. He opened the door just enough to reveal a familiar face, the tallest of the three men from the night before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Two others stood just behind him, their expressions unreadable, but their presence unmistakably threatening. The tallest man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy," he said, tone deceptively casual. "I see you've made company." He stepped forward, blocking the entrance fully, a silent warning in his posture. "I told you before. You're not welcome here. Any." He exhaled slowly, jaw still tight, eyes fixed on the door. "For now," he said. "But it's not over." Nothing like this ever is. She nodded, her presence steady, unwavering. Then we prepare. Together. For the first time, he understood fully what trust meant, not words, not promises, but standing together when the world had revealed its sharpest edges, when danger exploded, and when the past refused to stay buried. The envelope, the knocks, the threats, they were only the beginning. And now, with the night behind them and the unknown stretching forward, he realized that facing the secrets was no longer optional. It was inevitable. And the stakes had never been higher. The envelope, the knocks, the confrontations, they had forced him to face everything he had avoided. And in doing so, they had revealed something far more important. That even in a life shaped by uncertainty, trust and human connection could survive. He exhaled, a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time in months. He had survived the storm, but more importantly, he had chosen to let someone stand beside him through it. She reached for his hand, this time deliberately, and he didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, a quiet promise, a recognition of the bond that had formed through shared danger, fear, and honesty. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine the future not just as a survivor, but as someone who could live, who could trust, who could face the world without running. The past would always be a part of him. The danger might return. The secrets he had carried would always linger at the edges. But now he had a choice: to face it, to survive, and to protect the connection he had finally allowed himself to embrace. The morning light bathed the room, gentle, persistent, illuminating not just the apartment but the path forward. A new day had arrived. Reclaim his life. Together they faced the quiet dawn, aware that life would continue to test them, challenge them, and push them to their limits. But now, they would face it as one. The door to the past had closed, at least for now, and the door to a new beginning had opened. And he finally understood what it meant to survive, to trust, and to live.